everyone, and welcome to Workplace Therapy, a weekly podcast where we explore how we work together and how we heal together. My name is Sarah Gould, and I'm the VP of Learning and Development at Unity & Company. We're a consulting firm that specializes in leadership development and employee engagement. On top of that, I'm also the CEO and founder of my own consulting firm, Sarah Gould Consulting, where I focus on individuals and small business to optimize for success. Joining me today are my co-hosts, Scott, who is our CEO of Unity & Company, and Skylar, who serves as our Director of Special Programs. We've been talking a lot in recent weeks about the strength-based approach to leadership and personal development. Specifically, we've mentioned a tool called Clifton Strengths and how it helps us to gain a better understanding of our own unique strengths, a better appreciation of other people's strengths, and how it has formed the way we show up as leaders. Today, we're going to be starting a two-part series exploring this concept a little deeper. In today's episode, Skylar is going to share her Clifton Strengths results and discuss how these results have impacted her professional and personal life. Next week, it's Scott's turn to be on the hot seat, so get ready, Scott. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, Clifton Strengths is an online assessment tool that was developed by Gallup that produces a report that shows you what your natural strengths are. The report gives you insight into your top 5 strengths. The whole concept is built around the idea that you'll get much better results if you understand and invest in your strengths rather than spending your time and energy mitigating your weaknesses. Okay, now that that's out of the way, Skylar, are you ready to share?
Let's do it.
Why don't we start by telling us your top 5 strengths and maybe give us a couple of sentences about how each strength manifests you specifically.
So my first strength is learner, meaning that I like the process of learning and wanting to continuously improve. Second strength is input, which kind of goes along with learner nicely. It's about collecting and archiving information for thinking about later. Third is individualization, meaning that I look for unique qualities within people and try to understand what their life is like in terms of challenges and hopes and fears. Fourth is intellection, meaning I like to reflect and discuss ideas, theories, or philosophies. And fifth is context, meaning I like to think about the past and kind of like learn about the present by researching the past. And this definitely makes sense since one of my favorite subjects in school was history. So
I already have so much to say about how this matches how you show up. So this is awesome. But the question is, how did your strengths profile resonate with you when you first received the results? Were they things that resonated with you right away, or were there things that kind of took you longer to wrap your head around?
Yeah, I mean, given that my strengths are learning new information and reflecting on that information, I definitely liked this exercise of like taking the quiz and getting back these results and kind of going through them. I did resonate with most of the insights. I think there were a couple sentences that I'll read right now that like really I saw myself in. So the first one is like, by nature, you might go through life gleaning bits of information to add to your storehouse of knowledge. And I definitely kind of see that. Like I have like this like, warehouse in the back of my mind. And I just like have random Amazon parts of knowledge that like don't actually do anything, but they're there if I remember them. Another one is like, you're quite comfortable being alone with your books and your thoughts. And I could definitely just be living a perfectly happy life where I'm like reading most of the day. And then, like in the old days where they have a salon where you like bring people together to talk about like what you've just read or new theories of the day. That would be my ideal life. So that would be great.
I love that.
I feel like there were a couple things that I didn't resonate with at first. One of them was under input. The description said, like, I intentionally like to use complicated words to influence people. Maybe I do this so you guys can give me feedback. I don't really think of myself as super eloquent. So I had to reflect on that one. And I think I do try to use the information I've gained on people to try to influence them, which like saying it kind of sounds a little manipulative, but I am a Slytherin for Harry Potter fans out there, but I try not to use it in a manipulative way. It's just like, oh, how are they acting and like, why are they acting that way? And how can I like help them lead a better life?
You say that you're Slytherin, but your strengths profile is more Ravenclaw.
I know.
For the record, I am also Slytherin, so watch out, Scott.
Really? I'm not confident that I've done that assessment correctly. I think it's gonna, I think I have to go back and answer it now. And
we
see
need like
where I stack up.
We need like an overlap of like StrengthsFinder and Harry Potter houses.
Crosswalk it.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the $1 million idea. There you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is interesting, Skylar. Now, the results that you're referencing, have you taken StrengthsFinder since the first time you took it? Because I think when we first worked together, that was that the first time you took StrengthsFinder, like way back then? Okay. And then I imagine you've probably taken it a couple of times since then.
Yeah, it was interesting. I've taken it once with you, and then I took it once right before I went to business school. So I've only taken it twice.
Okay.
And so these results are a couple years old. But it was interesting because my top 5 didn't change at all. The order changed a little bit, but I think learner was always number 1. And then the other ones were still the same, just in a different order.
I was going to say this, I don't remember your full top 5 profile off the top of my head because we last worked together like 10 years ago, something like that. But it is, it's actually not anomalous that your top 5 have not changed, right? Like what Gallup would say is like your top 5 should be pretty cemented. Or if there are variations, it's like more likely that there was something that was in your top 10. There are 34 strengths profiles in totality, right? So you take the assessment, and the cheapest version gives you access to your top 5, but you can pay extra. I think Jake was talking about that when he was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. You can pay a little bit extra, and you can get a full stack rank of all 34 profiles, and you can see what is at your top and what's at your bottom. And so for you, your top 5 didn't change at all. For me, my top 5 has changed a little bit, but it's always been something in my top 10 that gets elevated to my top 5, depending on the context of like what I'm facing at the time, like from like a professional challenge perspective. But it's interesting because I remember doing it with you when we first started working together, Skylar. And I wondered at the time, I'm like, this is a very cerebral kind of strengths profile. It's a lot of like thinking and processing and gathering information. Right. And you were like, only a few years out of undergrad at the time. And so there was a part of me that was like, oh, maybe this is like a life stage thing. Maybe this is like, you're just entering the workforce. You're trying to kind of get your bearings. Like everything is changing at a very rapid clip. And so you're kind of like sitting back and learning and surveying the area. But it's like really interesting that even as you've taken more senior level experiences and you're now decidedly mid-career and, you're past, your MBA, that it's still like pretty solid and unchanged for you. So like, I'm interested in, in asking you, like, you first got those results when we first started working with each other, and now you've got a lot more experience and context under your belt, and you have roughly the same strengths. So have they changed at all in like how they show up for you, or do they resonate differently like now that you have the benefit of time and experience under your belt?
I mean, I think the learner still resonates with me the same way. The fact that I like chose to go back to business school, and if I had enough money, I would just live in school forever. So I think that one's pretty core to who I am. And I think even now, like thinking about the jobs that I've chosen and that I've liked, it's like if I'm not learning something at the job, then I get really bored with it and I just want to move on from it. And it's not that I cannot not be good at the job. It's just like I don't really want to be good at the job, which is like a I think a take back from the learner strength is like, if you're not learning at something, like you just come across as like not good at whatever you're doing. So, but I think otherwise it's been pretty core to like how I approach things in my life. And I don't see it as changing. I think one aspect that maybe you could help me kind of work through from a therapy perspective is like all of these strengths were in strategic, and then one of them was in relationship building. And like you said, like I was doing a lot of thinking, and this is how I've always been. I've just like to think about things, but the struggle has been the do part. So I would rather think and think and think and never do. And so I was always a little concerned with like execution of things and how I would actually be able to like execute on a strategy that I would put together. And I think this has resonated with like, I tend to launch things really quickly because I don't really like to execute. And so I just launch it and kind of see like, oh, this is now I can learn from whatever I've launched. But I don't know, how did you kind of see me as a person or as a, individual contributor trying to deal with like the strategic element, but not actually being at a very strategic like level position?
I don't know that I would say that your position wasn't strategic. So, I mean, maybe not at first. So for the listeners, just to catch you up, when Skylar and I first met, we were working for a large global, well, not large, it was a startup, but it was a globally distributed consumer electronics startup, right? So we sold a device that was like pretty cool. And, we sold it in multiple countries all over the world. And I was hired to run the global customer care department as well as customer insights. And Skylar was one of my first hires. You might have actually been my first hire. Like I inherited the rest of the team, and then I think you were my first actual hire. And we brought her in as an individual contributor, basically just like an advocate from a customer care perspective. Not just, I didn't mean to say that. Like I think I have thoughts about customer care advocacy and what some would consider entry-level customer service and support roles. But that's another podcast in and of itself. So anyway, I hired her for this entry-level role in customer care, but very quickly realized, Skylar, that like you were excellent at your job, but like you had so much more to give, right? And so much more to contribute. And I think that was because of your strengths profile, right? The fact that, after the initial onboarding period where we were just kind of learning about the company and the product and the culture and the correct answers to give our customers, to your point, you quickly kind of got bored and like started naturally trying to punch above your weight class, right? And take on more and more strategic things, whether it was within the purview of your role or not. And I remember we did StrengthsFinder or Clifton Strengths as a team building activity at the time. And I remember sitting on the floor, or not on the floor, on a couch in the foyer of our little depressing little office building. It reminded me of like The Office, like the Michael Scott office, it was like with the low panel ceilings and like the fake light. And it was like really depressing in there. And like everybody had their own corners or whatever before we got our real office after our Series B. But yeah, I remember sitting with you on the sofa there discussing your StrengthsFinder results and just kind of being in awe of how much intellectual horsepower this StrengthsFinder profile really kind of implied. And it got me thinking, like in that moment, I'm like, how can I put you to better use? Like, how can I deploy you against something that you would feel is like more engaging? I knew it had to be more strategic. Otherwise you would get bored and restless. Right. But then we also had a conversation. I don't know if you remember this, but we were talking about future career path. Like I talked to you about like, where do you want to be in 5 years? And at the time you hadn't considered business school seriously at all. Right. And I was like, well, maybe the path for you is like B school and then management consulting, right? Because you're always kind of learning, you're always engaging at a strategic level. You're working with executive teams. You don't have to necessarily do the execution. Right. And, so I remember feeling at the time that was something that I could see you stepping into quite successfully. And even though the path has been different. You did end up going to B school. You did end up taking on more strategic roles at the company that we were working at, and you are now consulting, So it's like, it's very interesting to see, looking down the tunnel of time, how that is manifested for you. But before I kind of come off the topic, Skylar, like one of the things that I'd say, as you're now the CEO of your own company and you're like, working on developing some apps and really kind of like spending time in the strategic phase and getting ready now to launch and execute, what I would say is like, there are a lot of different kinds of CEOs out there, right? Like there's your visionary strategic CEO, there's your subject matter expert CEO, there's your transformational leader CEO, there's your figurehead media relations CEO. You know what I'm saying? It's like, there are like lots of different CEOs where normally a CEO has like one really strong kind of skill, and then they build their team around that, to kind of complement and supplement, what they bring to the table. Right. And so for you, I see you as a visionary CEO. I see you as somebody who will spend a lifetime studying the landscape, studying the competitors, studying the puts and takes, collecting all the information. And one day you'll synthesize that into a hugely impactful idea. And I think the success of you bringing that idea to life and to market is going to be dependent upon you surrounding yourself with people with complementary strengths profiles, right? So if you're not, personally very drawn to the execution, like the heads down implementation work, that's what you would hire your COO to do, right? You would hire a COO that's just a rock star executor, and you can handle like the vision and strategic direction of the team. And so, yeah, so I looked down the tunnel of time like 10 years ago, and I'm looking down the tunnel of time again, and I'm fully anticipating that you are going to be that masthead CEO that's going to take a company to great places, and you're going to build a team around you based off of your acknowledgement of your own strengths, and then other people's strengths that might be complementary or supplementary to your own.
Well, I hope all your predictions come true. You should have like a prophecy, strength in you. Yeah.
I think what's so cool is whether, it's Strength Finder, Emergenetics, PI, I wonder if so much of taking the assessment is great knowledge at the time, but doing these reflective engagements is even more powerful, because I think, Skylar, to your point, when you talked about how these strengths have kind of shown up in your work life and where you've fallen short and how it's manifested over time, and then to hear Scott's reflection, it's almost like we can't just take this assessment and be done. Reflecting on it, even years later, it has just as much, if not more, impact than it did when you first took it, because now you have some data and experiences to really call upon whether this is who you are or not. And I wonder if you could share with us, how has the understanding of these strengths also impacted how you show up in your personal life?
Yeah, I think this is the hardest question for me, because work, it's just so tangible, and you're like, oh, I can see how what projects I took were because of my strengths, or how I reacted to this, or what performance review I got in a certain job. Personal, I think I did take some time reflecting on it, and I remember like growing up, I played a lot of sports, and I have more of a kind of quiet, empathetic approach. And I was seen not really as, competitive. And that was a weakness, I was told. And even with that feedback, I was, too stubborn to really change. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to stick with my ways of doing things. And I think that worked out fine for me, but I probably frustrated a lot of my coaches and like the people who were trying to help me in those roles. But I think like looking at these strengths now, it's kind of given me a permission to like really accept those differences and not think, everyone externally thinks that they're negative. And I think in terms of like friendships and relationships, I do consider myself a good listener, and I would rather be the one listening than talking. So this podcast has definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone. And I think I've gravitated towards people who feel safe to share that vulnerable information with me. And I hope they do, because I am just generally curious about other people. And I think my friends, like they show up in very different ways to me. Like they're very different friend to friend. And I think that's where like the individualization comes up, where it's like, oh, I just really appreciate that people can do things differently than me. Like what decisions I would choose definitely aren't the ones that my friends would choose. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I'm like, oh, that's great. That's admirable. I love that like they're choosing the right way for them. So I think like in my personal life, sometimes it's hard to be with people that are so different from you. But I think like the strengths that I have is learning about those people and, trying to find ways that, we can live and work together.
That's awesome. So it sounds like you've been able to take your results and, really apply it to situations outside of work in the way that you show up for your friends and show up for yourself. I think to Scott's point, when we were talking about, this is really about the strengths that we see and the greatness in you. And this is a strength-based approach in general. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about that, and really, what are the benefits and limitations of a tool like Clifton Strengths, in your opinion?
I really do like the strengths-based approach because if you only do focus on weaknesses, like you're always thinking about just how, terrible you are. And like, I don't think that's a good mindset to have. So I like the strengths-based approach. I also really like dualities in people. So like people can be one thing and then almost the complete opposite. So I can be a learner, or I can really like context about history. And I also don't have like the greatest memory. So it's like, I like to learn things and I like to, read about history and then I forget about them. And so I think what the Clifton kind of strengths finder, I think is missing a little bit are those like other personality traits, maybe like the introversion that they're kind of missing, so that you could make the whole, like your strengths plus your personality gives you a complete profile of you. So sometimes they don't come across as, oh, this is exactly who I am. And maybe that's the whole point. Like you are there to reflect on the strengths and how they show up, not necessarily be like, this is exactly who you are as a person. And this is like your life path now. There's no choosing on your own.
Yeah. And I think that's the power of the conversation and context that happens pre and post assessment. I think no assessment is perfect, and we have to make a decision as organizations, what approach do we want to take? And in this instance, it really is strength-based, but there's also this part of yourself that if you don't identify it and work on it, if it's something that you truly feel like is an aspect of yourself that you've always wanted to improve, you're missing a huge opportunity. So you mentioned introversion. Well, I think that's actually a superpower, and I wish I could be more like that because I'm literally the opposite. But I also think sometimes it's hard to think about when you see something as a strength that maybe you always thought as a weakness. So I also think it allows you to provide yourself more perspective when you take assessments like this, because you might have always had, a hang up or low self-esteem about some area of your life. But then you take something like Clifton Strengths and you find out, oh, they see this, the assessment sees this as an asset, me being a learner and taking my time and being reflective. Whereas you saw it as, well, I didn't really play well at sports because of, these traits, but being able to see it and shine a light on it, I think, I would imagine is also really transformative to the experience of going through this assessment.
I think too, so Skylar, I remember when we worked together originally, you had some conversations with me just about like introversion and being more on the quiet side. And I mean, I may have even at the time been pushing you to be more assertive and outgoing because that's kind of like the standard modality, I guess, like in the workplace. And that's kind of the problem, right? Is that the way that we have evolved from like an organizational cultural perspective really does kind of favor certain types of voices and certain types of communication styles. But in today's day and age, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think like one of the things that StrengthsFinder does do, like StrengthsFinder doesn't necessarily say, here's the correct profile for a CEO and here's the correct profile for a VP or a director, right? What it says is like, here are your strengths, right? And anything is still possible to you. Some things are just going to feel harder than other things, right? And so it's really about like, what is the highest and best use of your time? The highest and best use of your time is to lean into your strengths and try to figure out ways to use your strengths as the primary mechanisms for overcoming your challenges versus mitigating your weaknesses, right? And so I think a lot of managers and leaders with the best of intentions, they look around and they say, oh, the people who are really successful here look, talk, and act a certain way. And so I'm going to mentor you to look, talk, and act the same way. And what StrengthsFinder does is StrengthsFinder basically says, okay, you could do that. But if you're introverted, following that advice is going to feel like it's draining your motivational piggy bank, right? It's just going to feel hard and awful and just like painful every single day. So what StrengthsFinder really allows you to do is say, how do I use what I know comes easy to me? It's frictionless. Like if we left you with no direction, Skylar, like you would find every book you could on every subject that was interesting to you, right? Like you would pour over that stuff and research over things. We'd have to give you no direction to do that. It's just what your soul kind of craves, right? So it's frictionless for you. And how much easier would it be to lean into these superpowers of yours that are frictionless, come easy to you rather than mitigating these things that come hard? So with regards to being more assertive in the workplace or making yourself more known, rather than being that really annoying person that's sitting at the table that's like dominating with all of their, all of their interjections and all of their points, and they're really like not listening. They're really just looking for the setup for their next point so that they can secure their brownie points and move on, right? I mean, we've all seen that person. And annoyingly, that person seems to get ahead more often than not. But like also annoyingly, underneath the surface, there tends to be very little substance, right? And, if you were in that meeting, you probably wouldn't naturally be the person to interject and cut people off and set up your next point. But because you were a deep and thoughtful person, you will have thought through way more of the details than that guy is just like rapid fire trying to get things on the table. And you could explore ways of being influential, like scheduling a one-on-one meeting with the most influential decision maker at the table. Like you could say like, hey, I think the conversation today was really great. I see some opportunities that were not discussed that I did not bring up because they warranted a more in-depth discussion. And so if it's okay with you, I'd like to take 30 minutes to step you through my perspective. Or if it's easier, I can publish a white paper and send it to you and you can circulate it to your team. Like that's probably going to be a more effective approach for you versus for somebody else with a different strengths profile sitting and making a white paper. Just sounds awful, or scheduling a one-on-one meeting with somebody in a position of authority sounds terrifying, like there's safety in numbers kind of thing. So the way that you could have the same impact or greater just by having a knowledge of what your strengths are and tailoring your solutions to your strengths, not the other way around, like trying to make things strengths that are not organically strengths so that you can present the same solution that everybody else is presenting.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm making this phrase up, but it's almost like when you know what your strengths are going into, whether it's business or personal, you can have this confident humility about yourself because you recognize that you're not going to be good at all things, but you also recognize that you will approach things in ways that match who you are and how you show up, your character and competence. And I think it provides people greater access to the best version of you when you can have that confident humility. So I think it's a fantastic tool to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, Scott, it's been really helpful hearing your thoughts because you've known me for so long and you've worked with me in that way. And I would also, Sarah, you said at the beginning, like, oh, I can actually see how this, played out. And it is interesting to think about if strengths are immediate in our first impressions of people, or if those strengths kind of take a little bit of time to, show up. And I think it is how comfortable you are in those strengths, maybe how fast they come across. So did you see these first come across when we first started working together, which was not too long ago?
Absolutely. I noticed right away my first impressions of you were a careful and thoughtful approach. But what's interesting, and I think Scott and I have both said this in one form or another, you are very good at doing podcasts. And you are the one who's like the most nervous sometimes and come across as being like, oh my gosh, this is out of my, you said it earlier, it's out of your comfort zone. But you are, I think because you're so patient and thoughtful about the way you conduct yourself, the words that you use, you're able to facilitate in a way that is people want to listen. And the way you speak, the way you share your stories, it's compelling. And because I feel like I know your personality, you're probably inside being like, oh, really? Is that how I show up? Because I don't feel that way. But truly, even though this would, a podcast situation like this would typically say, oh, well, that's for extroverts. And, they just want, they love to talk in front of people and have no problem. In many ways, you're a lot stronger in doing this type of work than Scott or myself because you're mindful and you proceed with this elegance that, I get too excited and I'll interrupt or, we'll go on tangents and you bring us back. You keep us humble. You keep us grounded. And it's a profound gift that shows up fairly immediately. And I think really connects to those top strengths that you mentioned at the top of our episode.
Yeah. Oh man, I can piggyback off of that because I have an example that's like very top of mind. But Skylar, one of the things that you're great at, and I do see how it kind of integrates into your strengths profile is, so I'm a verbal processor. If you've listened to more than one episode or maybe just this episode, you've probably figured that out, which often means that like I will have a vague direction of where I think I want to go, but I will figure it out as I am talking, is how I will arrive at the destination. Skylar's like nodding and Sarah's okay. So it's true. Mm-hmm. It's fine. Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's true.
But the thing that I love about having like Skylar in my life is as we work together, You must be so frustrated with me, Skylar, like now that I think about this, because like I'll spend like 90% of the meeting like talking and like trying to arrive at a point that you came to prior to the meeting ever starting because you have slides, right? And you're like, okay, Scott, I just let you run out of steam. And you're right. Yay, you took 45 minutes to get there, but like I have these two slides that basically summarize everything that you've been trying to get at for like the last 45 minutes, but you'll let me run and get it out of my system. And then like, we'll be completely aligned by the end of the meeting. And then like, sometimes when I'm more cognizant of my approach, I'll let you go first. Right. And when you go first and you present your stuff, it's just very grounding, like very well thought out, very compartmentalized, like the ideas build upon each other. And like that level of precision and simplicity can only really come from somebody who has taken in the information, synthesized it, and then like put it into action. Right. And I think like, I mean, in business and in life, that's more rare than it should be, right? I think everybody, like a lot of people are really oriented towards ready, fire, aim, versus being more kind of deliberate about things. And yeah, so that's what I appreciate about what you bring to the table. I mean, you did it for me this morning, even. We were talking about our signature training programs and how to pitch them. And I was like really excited about all of the details, like all of the great stuff that is in the signature training program that we were developing. And Skylar, like your advice to me this morning was like, we need to simplify this into fewer themes so that it's not overwhelming and you don't lose the audience on the first slide. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually a really great point. And like, we still have a second and third attempt at bat further on in the slide deck to sell them on the more granular details, but let's not lose them at the outset. And I think that's the power, like, cause if you had put me in a room by myself and told me to like develop the slide deck, I probably would have given the theory of everything in one slide and lost the sale. But I think your approach is a lot more measured and a lot more prudent. And that's why I think we're a great team.
Mm-hmm. I would also say, Skylar, like, as you know, I'm super pumped about your app and need it to come out like yesterday. It's about travel and I need it in my life. But I also think some of that strength is I know that whatever product you create, whatever deliverable you have, it's been well thought out. It's been tested. It's a very thoughtful product. And it's funny because you were like, well, I'll put out stuff and it's, 80% done because I don't like doing the actual release of it. But I would argue that your 80% is better than most people's 110%. Because you've given it so much thought. I'm more like minimal viable product. I can do that in my sleep. I'll put it out at 40%. I don't care. Let's see what sticks, what doesn't. And again, it's like the validity and reliability of what you produce is unmatched. And so it makes me really, really excited about the things that you're working on, Skylar, in your own ventures.
Well, thank you. You guys are both so wonderful to work with. And I think that is the like power of the Strengths Finder is that we all have different strengths. I think if it would be cool to map all of ours against each other. And I think Scott and I have one in similar, I think. And then the rest of them are completely different. And I think that's what makes us work well together is that we can say, okay, this is like your strength. You go do that. That's your strength. I'll let you. There's like no, I guess jealousy
we're not
or
territorial.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
Well, it sounds like it's not only a good way to work together, but also just a powerful communication tool. Yeah. Well, that wraps up our discussion for today. Skylar, again, thank you so much for sharing your experience, being vulnerable, your perspectives with us. If after listening to this episode today, you're interested in pursuing career or performance coaching for yourself, or just want to know more about how you can bring leadership development and training to your own organization, feel free to contact us at info@workplacetherapy.net or info@unityandcompany.com. Don't forget to join us next week, where Scott will be sharing how his understanding of the strength-based leadership has dramatically changed his own journey as a leader. You will not want to miss it. We'll see you all next time.